Hi, and welcome to From Many People's Strength, the podcast that covers Saskatchewan politics and current events. My name is Cory. My pronouns are he, him.
And my name is David. My pronouns are he, him, or they, them.
Okay, cool.
Um, as we move into our eighth podcast, last week was our first podcast outside of the election cycle, but we still were doing a lot of recap.
Yeah.
I think now we're fully into some
Yeah.
some non-election type politics, and just in time for COVID to, I'd say, rear its ugly head again. But I think its head's been reared for a lot of the time. We were just ignoring it.
Yeah, that's right.
And not you and I ignoring it, but the world in general, unfortunately, ignoring it, I think. But it's making us pay the price for that.
Yeah, that's right.
I think that is affecting politics around the world, but certainly will be affecting Saskatchewan politics pretty significantly here as well. So,
yeah, exactly. It's certainly been, I guess, an easy way to say it is it's been troubling, right? Like the numbers are quite high for Saskatchewan. We are a fairly low population dense province, and we're in competition with some other places that are
the wrong type of competition.
Well,
that's and right. I think it's one of these things where, and sort of get on a bit of a soapbox here about science in general. I think so often this idea that changing people's minds or being wishy-washy or flip-flopping is considered this negative thing. But I think to some degree, I think we can look at the fact that science readjusts its prognosis.
That's an important feature, right?
is a feature, not a bug, right?
Yeah.
And I think we can look back on what we thought was going to be true in, I was going to say, March, but even like what we thought was going to be true in January, February, March, April, but even like what we thought was going to be true July, August, we're getting new data and it changes.
Yeah.
And I just think, we thought back in March that Saskatchewan, and I will be honest, I was thinking this as well, not to the extent where I pulled back on my precautions, but I thought that because Saskatchewan had a lower population density, we wouldn't be as vulnerable. I thought if places that have a lower population density still need to be careful. It's still a dangerous thing that's happening in the world, but that there's an added protection that comes from a lower population density. And it's now seeming like, while there may be a small degree of that still helping, not enough to be noticeable, not enough to overcome the overconfidence that comes from having it in the first place.
Right. Yeah.
You look at not just Saskatchewan, but other low population density areas in Canada, but also, the lower population density areas of the US. They're now the ones that are facing the worst brunt of it. So,
it seems pretty clear that if you don't take enough precautions, low population density isn't going to help.
Right. No, absolutely not. And it's one of these things where I think we want an easy fix. And I think it's one of the reasons why the precautions we do know about are, how do I put it, are to some degree facing skepticism, because there's no one thing that solves the problem. Right.
Yeah.
So you can't say, a mask will completely prevent.
Right.
Social distancing won't completely prevent, and low population density, like all of these little things, they add up to, help mitigate this disease, but no one item is gonna do it.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's frustrating. You almost think of it. I use metaphors and analogies a lot, and sports metaphors tend to work really well. You think about a football team. if the riders are out playing and there's 12 people on the field, a couple of them probably could take a play or two off here and there, and it's not going to have a huge outcome on the game.
Right.
But you never know which plays those are, and you never know which players those could be, right? And so the teams that are successful are the ones where you do have 12 players, or I'm watching NFL now because it's what exists. So 11 players, all clicking on all cylinders. So you don't wear your masks. That's like your offensive line taking a play off. Your quarterback's probably going to get hurt in most cases.
You can have your defense on the field the whole game, but you're still probably not doing as much as you could be doing.
Right. And like there's ways of getting around it. Maybe you'll get lucky and you can't point to, okay, well, they didn't completely take the play off, but they're only giving it 80%, 90%, what have you. And we all have to make judgment calls, right? You got to pick your plays. I don't think it's reasonable to have every single person live in complete and total isolation, wearing hazmat suits. We can't be 100% safe because life needs some compromises.
Right.
But you need to be focused on where you can make the difference. So,
yeah, I find that often people are saying like things like that, like where, okay, well, the mask isn't 100% effective, therefore it's 0% effective.
Yeah.
Or social distancing obviously doesn't work, or the numbers wouldn't be going up, right?
Yeah.
Stuff like that.
Very frustrating. And I think we get to, as we go through some of the news stories that are happening in Saskatchewan this month or this past week, we'll get to see some of those after effects, and it's pretty jarring. So that was a lot of high level, general term stuff.
Right.
Is there any specific stories you want to touch on as we start breaking things down a little bit more specifically?
I think early in the week, what day was it? Oh, I guess this is just marked for the 21st, the one that I've got here. The Saskatoon business leaders warn of dire consequences of the shutdown. The Saskatoon Chamber of Commerce put out a statement basically saying like a lockdown is going to destroy business in Saskatchewan.
Right.
And I've had a number of conversations. I don't know if I probably mentioned this on the show that I am an Uber driver.
Yeah.
And I've had a few passengers. And it seems, just on my random non-scientific polling, that most people understand that small businesses need to be supported, and that we're all worried that they're going to fall, if there's a lockdown. Nobody wants to hurt small business owners. Right. Apparently nobody gives a shit about Walmart, which is fine.
Yeah, I think I'm okay with that.
But yeah, everybody's worried about small business owners, but we also are all in a position where we're feeling like we do have to acknowledge that there may be a lockdown coming at some point.
Yeah.
And the statement from the Saskatoon Chamber of Commerce, it seems like, I don't know, it seemed a little bit more like not as health conscious as I would prefer it to be.
Yeah. There was a post from a restaurant owner recently that I saw. And one of the things they said was, even when we were not allowed to have any more than 50% capacity in our restaurant, we still were never full.
Right.
And they went on to say, it's not the restrictions that are killing us, it's the virus. And I think that's a thing we need to be aware of when we start talking about small business is like an absolute full-on lockdown, yes, is going to absolutely hurt businesses for sure.
Right.
But restrictions will probably slow things down a little bit compared to what just people are already doing based on common sense.
Yeah.
It also just comes down to, though, our economy is interconnected, and people dying and people needing severe hospitalization also hurts the economy,
Yeah, that's
right?
right.
Like, um, and the death, rightfully so, should always be first and foremost and front and center when we're talking about the impacts of COVID. Um, but from an economic standpoint, it's also really important to think about all of those other health impacts that come from COVID, because we know, give or take, it has a mortality rate in that 1% to 3% range.
Yeah,
2.5% seems to be pretty. Various stats will come up at various times.
yeah,
How flat the curve is makes a difference on that, because how much treatment you can provide will definitely make a difference. Um, but hospitals being overwhelmed, and I think we talked about this on previous episodes, or last week even. If your beds are full from COVID patients, what do you do with the person who's in a car accident?
right, right.
Um, those are all issues that you need to address. Um, and also things like, you don't take precautions, and your general manager's spouse gets COVID, and now
Right,
your general manager needs to go into isolation, or needs to be the one. His spouse is in isolation, but not sick enough to go to the hospital, so he's cooking and cleaning and dropping off food at the door of her room, waiting 15 minutes. She then opens the door, grabs the food. Like, your isolation within a single home is really difficult.
right,
How are you managing all of that? So he's now stressed, not focusing on work while at work, or having to take time off of work. That's lost productivity. Your head of HR is dealing with all of these health related issues. Your best salesperson is worried because her mom is sick, or her kids are caught between e-learning versus going in person. Like, there are all of these other things that impact the economy. And if you don't take precautions now, or realistically, you don't take precautions a month ago.
yeah,
But
yeah,
you don't do what you can to flatten the curve and to mitigate the impacts. Those economic drivers are also being affected.
yeah,
So this idea that we have to balance health and the economy is a false alternative, because
right,
focusing on health also helps the economy. Um, you know, I,
yeah,
it's easy to look at the U.S. and be like, "Oh, the U.S. is screwing up. They're got Trump in charge and da 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 da." But and I think to some degree, Sweden makes a better um, canary in the coal mine,
right,
because or a bellwether. Because Sweden isn't some anti-science right-wing dystopia.
right,
It's
yeah,
Scandinavian country, in a lot of socially progressive, a lot of their social elements and philosophies are similar to the other Nordic countries. They're not the same, and I would
yeah,
never say Sweden's the same as Finland or Norway, because they beat me up. But it gives you a really good benchmark to compare, right? Because they're geographically similar, relatively similar population density, similar climate, similar
right,
moral and ethical values. And you have Sweden, who didn't do any precautions, really didn't implement mask mandates or social distancing, tried to go, okay, we'll live life normally with a couple extra precautions here and there. Um, Not only is their death rate significantly higher than Norway, Denmark, and Finland, their economy hasn't bounced back the same way Norway, Denmark, and Finland's economies
yeah,
have bounced back. So now what we find is Sweden sacrificed health for quality of life.
Yep.
They didn't frame it as for the economy. They framed it as sacrificing it for quality of life.
Right.
But they sacrificed health unknowingly or accidentally for quality of life, and to some degree the economy. And now they're finding themselves in a spot where they sacrificed everything. Not only is the other Scandinavian countries or Nordic countries, they have better health outcomes, they have better quality of life now, and they have a stronger economy. The economy has bounced back stronger. So as much as I understand the fears of the Chamber of Commerce, and like you and I have talked before, I am not some anarchist communist. Like as left wing as I am, I'm a pretty dyed in the wool capitalist.
Right.
Like I'm a progressive capitalist, but I'm a pretty hardcore capitalist. I think you need to acknowledge that there can be things in place to help mitigate the negative impacts, but the idea of risking the infection exploding within the province does not outweigh, far outweighs the benefit of gambling.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. Like, you need a healthy populace to have a healthy economy.
Yeah.
And you can say all you want that shutdowns are going to hurt the economy, but ultimately, if everybody's sick or staying at home because they're scared of getting sick, you have a lockdown anyway. You just haven't mandated it.
Yeah, and it's it's longer one too.
Right.
Yeah. You also undermine trust, and like I'm all for distrust of the government, but in times like this, you want to be able to trust them with the guidelines that they're providing safe, rational, and science-based guidelines. And it doesn't seem like that's the case. You know what? I thought the Sask Party did okay 6 months ago. If we look back, and we talked about this going into the election, I thought the Sask Party's response, March, April, June, and most conservative politicians in Canada in general in March, April, June did a pretty good job of putting politics second.
Yeah, they didn't hop on that denialist bandwagon right away, right? They didn't say masks are a liberal hoax or whatever.
Exactly. And I think maybe it was just too much to ask for more than 6 months of goodwill.
Maybe.
and don't get me wrong, I think the federal Liberals have not been necessarily the best at every element of this. I think they've done a good job in general managing COVID, but I think even they have started to play politics with things at times, and I think I think as soon as one side, and I don't know who to point the finger at on this, or I don't think there's maybe value in that anyways, but as soon as one side starts to play politics, it kind of sparks everyone playing politics. Right. And that's true of the NDP, that's true of the Conservatives, that's true of the Liberals. It's really true of everyone, and it's unfortunate that happened. I guess that's the nature of the beast in a competitive democracy that we have.
Yeah, I found, I guess that's not the topic we're on right this second, but there are ways you can point at there are flaws and holes in the federal response.
Yeah.
Especially after that initial, 6 months or 4 months or whatever it was, right? Like as it got longer and longer, like they start making statements about, like they start pulling back the support system. They start making statements about, well, our support isn't infinite, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And almost making it sound like they're threatening if certain provinces don't do certain things, then they will pull support. And it's just like, okay, but it's the people that need the support. So this is all I think it's, I mean, as you said, like I thought Liberals did a good job at the start.
Yeah.
Just like I thought Scott Moe and the Sask Party did a good job at the start. But just like people now are all going to the Cornwall Center and ignoring social distancing because they're too bored to think about it in a critical way.
Yeah. I think you also, I get a little esoteric and theoretical here. You have a bit of the tragedy of the commons going on as well, where we're all required to make sacrifices of our own needs for the well-being of everyone else. And I think you start to get some degree of, well, if everyone else isn't doing it, why should I?
Right.
And I'm fighting that. I have someone in my bubble who has to be in my bubble. I really have absolutely no choice in them being in my bubble. And they are a lot more reckless than I would like.
Yeah.
They're attending a lot of public social events, and there are events that have, I'm sure there's masks there, and I hope there's social distancing.
Right.
But even like 4 or 5 months ago, I saw a picture of them at an event, hugging someone else, and neither were wearing masks. I'm like, fuck. And then I'm going like, okay, so this person's in my bubble. I have no choice but to have them in my bubble. Yeah. They're taking risky behavior, but I'm still not visiting my parents at Christmas, and have been gone more than a year without seeing my parents or my sister. And that's a shitty sacrifice to have to make. And there are other sacrifices I'm not making. Like I have a partner from Saskatoon who is very, very good at remaining isolated. And they came down for a 2-day visit recently. And we've had, I think, since February, 3 visits with each other. But again, they are immunocompromised, so I have to make sure it's been, I go at least a certain number of days without having contact with the person in my bubble who's more reckless than I would like. I'm making sure I'm clear what the risk factors are. I have kids, so that does add a vector for them. But we talk about it in advance and make that judgment call. And again, we talk about you can't eliminate everything,
right?
So we do end up seeing each other.
And like you say, like if you have somebody in your bubble who is slightly less cautious than yourself, it creates a you're basically not, you almost don't have a bubble at that point.
Yeah. Right. And like, I take precautions around this person, to some degree, to the most I can. But sort of going back to that thing, I'm sure we all have things like that where we're seeing things happen that we wish we could do too, but don't because we're willing to make that sacrifice.
Right.
And then have that, well, it becomes really tempting if they're not being cautious, why should I? And
yeah. Luckily, I've got a smug sense of superiority over everybody. So
perfect.
I see people not being careful, and I go, "What the fuck is wrong with you?"
Yeah, that's fair. Maybe I should try working on that more. So
yeah,
but yeah, no, I hear you, and it'll be interesting to see how things go. One of the other comments I saw the other day, and it was one of those ones I'm like, those things you read online that kind of hit you in the gut and go, oh yeah, fuck. So what's the first thing you're going to do once you've gotten vaccinated? And the response was, continue socially isolating and wearing a mask for a month until I'm able to go get the second vaccine, and then wait an additional 14 days after that in order for the antibodies to build up, and then continue waiting until there's been enough widespread adoption of the vaccine for there to be, and like, shit, we're as much as we'd like to think, okay, there's 2 different vaccines now.
Yeah, with a good effectiveness rate, but
with a good effectiveness rate and it's seeming like minimal side effects. If like there's positive news, but from the day that vaccine or either or both of those vaccines are cleared for widespread use, we still have 3 more months of this.
Yeah.
Right. We're probably looking at least 3 more months of unprecedented times. Once that's happened, and even that's still a couple months away. I don't think we're going to wake up tomorrow and find out it's been cleared for widespread use. So
yeah, and I was listening to something where they were discussing this, and they said like, okay, so phase 1 is like they test it for side effects.
Yeah.
Phase 2, they determine the dosages needed.
Yeah.
And phase 3, they determine effectiveness. But even once we know the effectiveness, we don't necessarily know yet how long it will last and give you immunity for.
Yeah.
So it could last forever. It could last 3 months.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Ultimately, we still have to move forward very cautiously, and we can't say like, okay, we got the vaccine, game over, we're all back to normal now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think again, broader philosophical thoughts, but I think this is one of those global events that shifts the way the world works. Like, I think a year from now, we will not be living the same way we're living today, but a year from now, we won't be living the same way we lived a year ago.
Yeah, and it almost won't be recognizable anymore, right? Like,
yeah, I think it'll be recognizable, but I think you'll find differences. I think you'll find, I'm hoping you'll find a greater awareness of how likely this is. I don't think we're waiting another 100 years for this to happen again. Like, if we think about a pandemic of this scale, it's been 100 years. Going back to 1917, 1918. I don't think we're waiting that long for the next one. I think you're going to find that these are getting closer and closer together in time frame, just because we are more interconnected now. There's more range there's more possibilities of transmission happens faster, like all of that. So I think you're going to find we need to have
just the nature of international travel.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that becomes a critical part of any provincial health strategy is, what do you have in place for next time?
Yeah.
And I don't think it's too early to start asking that. I think that's one of those things where, over the course of the next year, I would love to hear Scott Moe come out and say, all right, above and beyond everything that's happening this time, here's what we're putting in place to be prepared for next time. And I think politically that's dangerous, because then you're acknowledging that there's going to be a next time, and people don't like bad news.
No, that's true. But it would be very responsible, right? Like, it would be a very forward thinking.
Yeah. So one of the other, you talked about how this impacts, small business owners, and I think both you and I agree how it affects the workers of businesses, both big and small. Is probably even more important. But one of the other stories that I know you had wanted to talk about this week, and I think is important to talk about too. There was the example of the woman from Regina who ran into issues with receiving CERB and technically not having been eligible for it, and there being consequences from that.
Yeah, it seems like this is not an isolated incident either.
Mm-hmm.
Like, when CERB rolled out, the requirements and information around it wasn't clear, or wasn't, I mean, maybe it was out there if you looked for it, but it wasn't super clear and it wasn't super obvious. And a lot of people went on CERB despite already being on some kind of assistance.
Right.
And because we live in a society that doesn't like to add those things together, many provinces, and Saskatchewan is one of them, clawed back every dollar that you got through provincial assistance if you were on CERB. And so one woman, in particular, one woman for sure, is facing eviction because of this. And there's a number of people who are also in Saskatchewan who are facing eviction for various reasons similar to this, because a lot of people still aren't back to work. Restaurants and stuff are still only at 75% staff instead of back to 100% staff. And they're in Saskatchewan, according to this one article that came out on today, which is the November 22nd, Saskatchewan landlords have filed more than 1,000 eviction applications for the Office of Residential Tenancies since August 4th, which is to get a sheriff to remove tenants. And that's not saying anything about how many people who just moved out voluntarily after they got the eviction notice. So, I mean, I know I rent, and my situation is difficult. I've been struggling to pay my rent, and I've been working very hard to do that, but I have a very understanding landlord.
Right.
So, but some landlords aren't like an individual who owns a house. They are a company that doesn't actually know you. They just hire somebody to take care of the building, and you're just a number. You're just income. And if you aren't paying that money, they will evict you, and that's that.
Yeah.
And this is not, I mean, obviously people all over the country know this. This is a major issue. Housing is we're facing a housing crisis in Canada and in North America, where so many, like, we can't have this many people going homeless. It's just not a thing that is tenable. Homelessness costs our system, our society, way more than giving people homes and having them in houses, even if they aren't paying their rent. So we need to find some balance somewhere.
Absolutely. No, I 100% agree. I think the CBC story that sort of I think they did what a lot of good media does, which is it humanizes a broad story. So if anyone has listened to that story on the CBC that we're talking about, I think it really does put a voice to a story, voice to some numbers, but the numbers are broader than just this one woman. And I was trying to, listen through and piece together the numbers, but essentially it sounded like, she received $2,000 from CERB, unaware that she wasn't eligible for it. She talked about how she phoned in, and at no point did anyone say, she never lied. Essentially, is what it comes down to. She called and said, "Hey, can I get this? Can I get the COVID money?" And the person at the other end of the line said, "Yeah, what's your social insurance number? What's your date of birth?" They didn't sort of ask any questions, and like I said, it very much seemed like at no point did she lie.
And then when she reported that income that she was on that to Saskatchewan, then they talked about clawing back her money.
Yeah, and they didn't tell her they were doing that either. That was she told her because she gets social assistance. Sounds like she gets $1,200 per month, 800 of it for rent, and that 800 goes directly to her landlord. So she doesn't actually get that $800.
Right. Yeah.
So it's not a case of, okay, she just, she didn't see it go into her bank account. And no, it just goes directly to her landlord. And she just assumes that happens. So the reason for the eviction is 3 months, 3 months went by, and she's now 3 months in arrears on her rent. So she's down $2,400. And this is like, what's frustrating. The province of Saskatchewan is essentially profiting off the federal government. At this point, we talk about the provincial autonomy minister or whatever they were calling that. Like, we got to be aware that this is a matter of this woman, instead of getting $800 a month, or $1,200 a month, and I don't know if she was getting the extra $400 as well, but I think that was continuing on. It was just the $800 that didn't happen.
Right.
So she's now, the provincial government took $2,400 that they otherwise would have been paying this woman. She's on disability. She's physically unable to work.
Yeah, that's right.
So she cannot work. So the provincial government saved $2,400 off of this woman who received $2,000 from the federal government. No one told her, and this landlord. And from the landlord's perspective, and I'm certainly not sympathetic to a landlord who's evicting this woman, but that landlord is out the $2,400 too. Like he or she or they are not going to get this $2,400 at this point,
right?
If they've evicted her. The other thing that's important to note about the story is the federal government has given very clear direction to the provinces, saying if someone received this money in error, do not claw it back.
Right.
They're saying, it's small, like it's such a small amount to a government that it is not worth the time, energy, and effort for fighting this. And my guess is, the provincial government saved $2,400 by not paying this woman, her disability benefits that she needs to not die. It probably is, when all is said and done, going to cost them close to that, if not more than that, between the added costs to the social infrastructure in terms of rentalsmen's offices and whatever happens to this woman once she's no longer in her home, healthcare costs, other social wellness costs, like all of those things are going to be more than $2,400. And we see this time and time again on any of these hurdles or roadblocks that get put in place for any type of social assistance. This is obviously bigger than COVID, but when governments put in drug tests for people receiving social assistance, or all of these other hoops to make people jump through, it almost always costs the government more money than they save.
There's almost so little fraudulent activity of people claiming social assistance that it almost may as well not exist. And they spend all this time and money searching for it, that it's I don't know. It makes me so mad.
Well, and I think there's this idea that we don't want someone to get something they don't earn. Right.
Which is nonsense.
And it's literally, we're willing to cut off our nose to spite our face. I remember, pulling thought experiments on my children. I remember years and years and years ago, I think my kids were like 2 and 4, 3 and 5 or something, like really, really young at the time. And I remember saying, okay, going up to them and saying, all right, give you a choice. What would you rather have? You and your brother both get 2 cookies each, or you can have 3, but he'll get 6. And it's a tough choice. Right? And that's how our brains work, right? And like, in isolation, your choice is, well, what would you rather, 2 or 3 cookies? 3, of course, right? Like that's an easy choice. But as soon as you add but someone else is going to get something that they didn't, that they don't deserve. And there's so many other applications of this. I remember this is a bigger and a somewhat darker application and thought experiment. But I talked about
it's almost worse, because you're like, for society, it's more like, okay, I'm going to give you this bag of cookies, but I'm going to give that person 1. And society's like, no, they don't get that one.
Yeah, absolutely. And we kind of like that. Humans' brains are weird, right? We evolved in an environment where social consequences for unfair behavior, what feels like cheating the system should be punished on a social level in order to ensure mutual altruism and non-zero sum interactions, right? Because the one thing that'll blow up a non-zero sum interaction is someone trying to exploit the system. So we want to
Yeah.
punish that. Like that's ingrained in us at a very, visceral
reciprocal
level.
altruism and all that.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So we don't like people getting that something for nothing. But there's so many places where it's so ingrained that it just happens. Like, you work for, you talk about you work for Uber. Well, the value of your labor is far greater than what you're paid.
Right.
Right? Like Uber's a good one, right? Because you probably can see almost exactly how much.
Oh,
Because
yeah.
you know exactly how much the client is paying to Uber, and you see how much of that you are getting back. And part of that is you're paying Uber for the use of their platform effectively.
Right.
But part of it as well is just they're the owner. There's someone somewhere getting money sheerly out of the fact that they own things.
Yeah.
They've done zero, and that's the core of capitalism. It's what makes capitalism distinct from just free market. Is capitalism allows you to earn wealth simply from owning, by a sheer accident of birth in some cases.
Yep.
As unearned as possible if it's someone who is inheriting wealth, right? So we don't view that as unfair for some reason, but
yeah, you would think that although people do recognize that as unfair, they just somehow justify it to themselves that is part of the system. That we sacrifice that unfair situation because I could potentially become an owner.
And like, good on people for learning the system.
I guess. Yeah.
And there's, I talk about how, I'm not anti-capitalist in general terms,
right?
But, I think it's important to recognize that capitalism doesn't work if you don't soften its edges.
Right.
I'm someone who studies sort of the history of economics and economic theory at times. And again, I was fascinated by the study of Keynes, because Keynesian economics is sort of one of the bulwarks or the hallmarks or bedrock of sort of left-wing capitalist philosophy. Like it is at the core of sort of progressive left-wing economics.
Yep.
But it was created to stop communism at its core.
Right.
The history of it was, we're dealing with an economy that wasn't helping the people. There was a growing appetite for, it doesn't sound dissimilar from today in some ways, right? There was this growing appetite for communism, social, so I think the Red Scare was overblown in the U.S., but the idea of communism taking root and sort of being imposed within the U.S. in the 1930s is not as outlandish as many think. Like, I don't think it was as dire a threat as some think, but it was also not as small a threat as others think. Like, it was a real, tangible risk. There was legitimate concern about authoritarian, anti-free market, anti-capitalist governments coming in place and movements being imposed through violence. And to some degree, like that, Keynes comes along and says, all right, we need to prevent that. Preventing it through violent suppression isn't going to work.
Right.
We've seen that, and it can sometimes delay, but it usually, but it's a gamble. Like, it's a pretty huge gamble to do that. But if we, again, soften the edges of capitalism, if we make it so this system works for people, we can prevent some of the things we see happening in Europe from happening here, and thus you have Roosevelt's New Deal. Gross oversimplification here. I think, again, bringing it to sort of a Saskatchewan element, I think you need to be cognizant of that from a Canadian and the Saskatchewan perspective. Not that we're going to have violent Bolshevik uprisings in Yorkton, but
although we should.
But that, those who do like the status quo need to start understanding that. And I guess this is that, revolutionary versus reform.
Right.
Maybe the revolutionaries should want the status quo to maintain because things get crappy enough.
That's the accelerationist type argument,
which,
right?
yeah.
I'm not particularly a fan of it.
No, accelerationism basically is rich white privileged folks saying it's okay if minorities get killed so they can feel better about themselves. There's my no nuance November take of accelerationism. But you need to be aware that if you're not implementing reforms, if you're not, again, creating those cushions in place so that people can find their way through the world that we currently exist in a way that the food stays on their table and a roof stays over their head, they're going to take steps that you're not going to like.
That's right.
I think it's good to make sure people aren't dying in the streets because it's the moral thing to do. But also, in addition to that, from a purely cold-hearted, pragmatic, ruthless perspective,
it keeps the revolutionaries placated.
Exactly. And you want that.
Well, those in power certainly should.
Those in power should. And again, we where's that line on, eventually can we get enough reform through that sort of thing that people are actually happy and healthy and living enriched, fulfilling lives? I think that's even better. And I think history shows that that's better for the rich as well. Like that is very much a would you like a bag of cookies that's double the size, but someone who you think doesn't deserve to get a cookie gets one?
Right.
Like, give them one cookie so you can have double the number of cookies. All of our and like,
don't be daft.
You see that like the stock market is one of the absolute worst methods of determining the health of an economy because it determines the health of the economy for the rich. That said, the stock market in both Canada and the US consistently is stronger performing under the left-wing government than the right. Like, it performs stronger under Democrats than under Republicans. I was on a conference call in the week after the U.S. election, looking at that data on typically, Democrat versus, and that it was intense. It broke it down by, president, Congress, Senate, cross and and what was the performance of the stock market, the S&P 500, NASDAQ, TSX. It broke it down at all of those.
Okay.
But the consistent theme throughout all of it was when Democrats are in charge in the U.S., the stock market does better. And you can speak to them that, they're the corporatist party rather than a true left-wing party. This is going back, 100 years to back when they were, during time periods where they were more left-wing.
Right.
But the same is true in Canada. And you see the same being true on smaller scales. You see the same thing being true in Europe, and there's outliers, but for the most part, when you make sure that the bottom 70% of people are doing okay, it has a positive impact on the top 1%. Trickle down economics doesn't necessarily work all that well, but trickle up economics really does.
Yeah, that's right.
So that was a huge tangent from a woman kicked out of her house. So I apologize to anyone listening who's like, what does this have to do with Saskatchewan? But
it has everything to do with Saskatchewan. This is all part of it.
So I think there were a couple other stories, but I think a lot of the COVID ones we sort of touched on as we went. The spike in rural Saskatchewan. So it's not just the province as a whole, but rural has tended to do even worse, and that's where you see the greatest denial of masking. The Leader Post had a really good article about that, but I think we sort of touched on that in general.
Yep.
The COVID alert app.
Yeah.
I don't know if we want to.
It's just that but nobody here uses it apparently.
Yeah.
So I don't know how much detail we need to go into, but
it's unfortunate. I think again, it could have been a valuable tool. From everything I'm hearing, it seems like we're going to very soon be past the point at which contact tracing is a useful tool.
Yeah.
So I think the app could have been useful, and it's slowly losing its usefulness.
Yeah.
And then we have a couple non-COVID related stories to touch on briefly, I think, as well. Any specific you want to dive into in our last few minutes here?
Well, I just wanted to mention this one article. The YMCA is closing 2 locations in Regina. And there's a lot of people who are really upset about this, and that's totally fair. It's kind of a staple of our community in various ways, and it sounds like only the one in the Northwest is going to be open, and that's about it.
Yeah.
So,
which the downtown one closing, I think, is.
Yeah, it's a big deal, eh?
I think the downtown one even had shelter beds as well. I think so. I'm not sure what's happening with those, but I think that's still an issue. I'm a YMCA guy from way back.
Okay.
Like I worked as a camp counselor for the YMCA camps when I was a teenager. Had attended them my entire childhood, both like even before I lived in Saskatchewan. It's my family has, like, my dad was involved with the YMCA back from when he was, I don't know, single digit age all the way through his college years. He continued working for the YMCA. So this one hits me kind of on a personal level, I think.
Yeah, well, that's fair.
I think I'm glad that the Northwest is still staying open. The southeast one closing is, I think, really unfortunate because it's close to my home. But I have to admit, I canceled my membership. A couple of years ago to save money. I wasn't getting my money's worth out of it. I think if the southeast one had had a pool, that would have been different. But that would have added costs for them.
Yeah.
One of the things, and this is my crazy harebrained scheme, that I think the logistics of it probably would have been out of reach, but I envisioned probably about 3-4 years ago, an idea where the city and the YMCA could try and enter into some sort of partnership where you could get a membership to both.
Okay.
Pay 1.5 times what a membership to either one of them would cost, and you get a membership for both. And it's a win-win for everyone, right? So anyone who wants to buy that membership, it's a little bit more expensive, but you're getting access to both.
Right.
Each partner, so the YMCA and the city, would only get 75% of the cost of that membership, but they would get, assuming that it's an equal number of each. So instead of getting 10 memberships and 10 memberships, and you each get 100% of 10 memberships, you're getting 75% of 20 memberships.
Yeah.
And that actually works out to more money for the YMCA, works out to more money for the city, and it's convenient for the individuals. But that was, for me, ultimately what did me in for giving up my Y membership. It was more convenient to get a membership through the city. And I couldn't justify paying for both for my family, right? I couldn't get swimming lessons. The swimming lessons I wanted were, my kids had taken swimming lessons to the Y from age 6 months old all the way through to about 2-3 years ago, and then we switched to the city lessons just because they were more convenient.
Right.
There were other things about the quality of the lessons that I appreciated more as well, but these community dollars are so tough within any city. It's sad when some of the community needs, fall through the cracks. One of the other things, you and I talk about, approaching things from a progressive thought point. One of the things, though, that this does do is it puts the lie to the idea that private charity can fill the role of government.
Right.
Because a lot of the services that the YMCA provides, they have had to provide over the years because there has been a social deficit provided by government supports.
Yeah, and then they have to make the money to do those social things.
Yeah.
So
absolutely, like the money that they're earning from, rich white people in Wascana paying for swimming lessons, that's not a profit. That goes to cover benefits to this city. And I think, like I said, I think it puts the lie to the idea that is something that can fill a gap on a long-term basis, because it works great when it works, and then when rough patches happen, it falls by the wayside. And now when you need it most, those programs aren't there.
Yeah, and like you say, like it's not because government gets reliant on the private charity to do certain things.
Yeah.
So then it forgets that it was ever, like, the governments always forget that it was even a part of their mandate at one point.
Yeah.
So then, like you say, then the YMCA shuts down and a lot of programs get shut down with it. Yeah. And now there's just those programs just don't exist.
Well, like I will give a shout out to, Sally Elliott at the downtown YMCA. I imagine, I can't even imagine how many tens of thousands of babies in this city were delivered by parents who took her class at the YMCA.
Right.
Any parent of a child less than 20 years old who had a child in Regina will know Sally and will have stories of, on the first day of their prenatal class, her jumping onto a table at, I think she's ageless. I want to say she's 80, but sometimes she feels like she's 22. She has more energy than I ever could. In a lot of cities, though, like, prenatal classes are run by the health region. We just happen to have this superhero woman who works through the YMCA here.
Right.
But again, it's, and I'm not saying every single thing in the world has to be provided by the government. There are some things that, make sense to come from private industry. And even charity plays a role sometimes. But economies of scale make government a heck of a lot more efficient than charities, as much as there is this myth that governments are inefficient. I would love to see the city stepping in to fill this gap on before and after school programs, youth leadership programs, charity work that the YMCA in and of itself was a nonprofit, but they also spearheaded youth charity programs themselves, or charitable work that they themselves then carried on. So I would love to see the city government and the provincial government, and heck, even the federal government, stepping in to fill that void that's going to be left by that gap. So
yeah, we'll see what happens, I guess.
We will. Only other thing, do we want to touch on the NDP
the federal
wealth tax?
I mean, I guess we kind of already talked about this a little bit
Yeah.
with our ranting about homelessness and stuff. But yeah, the NDP put a bill forward federally for a wealth tax. It had some other stuff rolled in there too. Like there was some stuff about guaranteeing pharmacare and guaranteeing like universal, I can't remember, housing or something. And I mean, stuff that I believe in, but stuff that was just guarantees. It wasn't like it was just saying we will do this or we will work towards this.
Right.
The big thing was the 1% tax on income earners over $20 million. And well, I mean, the NDP and the Greens were the only ones who voted for it. The Bloc, the Liberals, and the Conservatives all shut it down because they don't work for us.
It is super rare for a government to vote for any budgetary bill put forward by an opposition party. But this one, it's a tough one to bite. And I am surprised that Trudeau didn't do a Trudeau.
Right.
Steal the NDP's idea and call it.
Take it and say, yes, hey, look. Oh.
And maybe he still will, but
just not today.
Just not today. I think it'll be, yeah. And again, this goes down to, I don't think people understand how much $20 million is.
No, I don't think so.
Like, and one of the things that I find interesting, you and I've talked about this a little bit before too, but when people talk about the rich, I often hear people talk about CEOs.
Right.
CEOs of big companies. And then you know what? The CEOs of some of the biggest companies still wouldn't pay taxes on these.
Right.
Because being a CEO is still work. And work doesn't make a lot of money. Yeah. Grand scheme of things. Obviously, if you're making $5 million a year, that's a lot of money. But
right.
This isn't CEOs. This isn't someone who is paid to do work. No one is paid to do work that makes this money. Even work
that's right.
Like CEOing or CFOing. Being a CFO or a CEO, that is still labor, white collar labor, but labor.
Right.
And it will not make you enough in and of itself to be subject to a wealth tax. A wealth tax is purely for people who make money without working. It is purely, almost exclusively on money made by people who make their money by not working.
Yeah.
Because that's what generating wealth through capital is. And there's reasons for why we tax it the way we do. But ultimately, capital gains taxes being taxed at 50% is, no one really talks about that a lot. But the fact that if you make $100 million by sitting on your butt and not working, it will be taxed at half the rate that someone who makes that same $1 million if they made it through labor.
Yeah.
That whole something for nothing thing gets really flipped on its head when it comes
pretty frustrating. Yeah, no kidding. One of the things that they put in this was it called for an excess profit tax on big corporations that the NDP said have been profiteering during the pandemic. This would include big companies like Amazon or Uber or even Instacart, which went from an almost nothing startup last year to the primary source of grocery delivery in Canada right now, and is on the verge of going public. Like the pandemic, they blew up for them.
Yeah. And I empathize with objections. You want to reward innovation, and you want to, if there's a niche that needs to be filled, and would the services still get provided if? And I think ultimately the answer to the question is, would these services still get provided if there was a more reasonable tax? Is yes, absolutely.
Yeah, of course they would.
So I think that's I think, and I would need to sit down and look through the bill with a bit more of a fine-tooth comb to know if there were elements in it that are problematic.
And it's entirely possible that it's not a perfect, right? Like but yeah, it just seems like the arguments against it weren't nuanced, well-reasoned arguments. They were the same old hacked, well, businesses will move, rich people will leave the country if we tax them an extra 1%. Businesses can't hire people if we tax them an extra 1%. Stuff like that.
Well, I think you refer it back to committee at that point, and you if there are individual elements in it, you hammer them out,
right?
And again, you do the classic liberal maneuver of, hey, the NDP had a great idea, let's take it and steal it and make it our own.
Exactly.
Like that's how we have healthcare.
Right.
Like you have socialist governments in Saskatchewan and Quebec who implemented socialized healthcare, and then the federal Liberals had a minority government. The NDP twisted their arm, and the federal Liberals went, "No, we created this."
Right.
And all sorts of things that happened under the Pearson government, the Pearson minority government specifically, are like that. Of the Liberals stealing from the NDP and making it their own. And again, who cares who gets? I don't say who cares who gets credit, because ideally I'd like
the right people,
ideas. But at the end of the day, if heck, I don't even care if the Conservatives get credit if it means that people who need to get taken care of are getting taken care of. So I would have liked to have seen that. So
kind of a random tangent. It's kind of funny these days. I'm hearing a lot of people like crediting Aaron O'Toole as the pro-labor conservative leader. Like he's suddenly a pro-union guy, even though he's made some pretty anti-union statements in the past, but now he's marketing himself as the pro-union guy, the pro-labor guy. So that's fun.
Yeah. I'm curious as to see where that goes.
Yeah, me too. I'm not sure if he can sell it. But
I was gonna say Trump won Ohio.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So and like Trump won the union vote in Ohio.
So weird.
So it'll be interesting to see. Well, like O'Toole's going to win Saskatchewan no matter what. Like at the end of the day, he could shoot someone on downtown Fifth Avenue and he's still winning. Like, we have a provincial premier who literally killed someone and showed no remorse over it. O'Toole's going to win this province federally.
That's right.
We had Ralph Goodale as that single red holdout for a long time, and if even Ralph couldn't hold, Regina, the only possibility at this point would be the two northern ridings. I'm not sure how the breakdowns go anymore. But we can refocus on that a bit more when the federal but the two northern ridings may go orange or may go red, but
we'll have to see how that goes. But all right, well, I think I've all my topics kind of burnt through, so
I think there is one topic that we were gonna maybe touch on, the reeve of Sherwood, but I think that's I'm sure we can leave that for another day. But it was an interesting story, and I think most of it's a delay, so maybe we can reconnect on the case against the former RM of Sherwood Reeve. It's been adjourned till January, so maybe on our January episode we can dig into that one a little bit more. So
that sounds good.
Awesome. Well, it turns out that even without elections, we can find enough things to talk about. Me specifically in my random rambling. Thank you, Cory, for putting up with it, and anyone listening along. Thanks for listening as I go on my wacky tangents about theory and philosophy.
Some very insightful stuff. I think a lot of people would benefit to listen to it. So they can find us at anchor.fm/from many peoples. You can follow us on Twitter at skpoliticspod or Facebook at facebook.com/from many peoples strength pod. Or you can email us. Still nobody has. From many peoples@gmail.com. So I think that's it for the day.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and we'll chat with you again next week.
Awesome. Have a good one.